Welcome to Quest for Quest. In this series, I review and rate episodes of the real adventures of Jonny Quest. In my opinion, the show works best when it combines a solid mystery for the mind, with emotional thrills for the heart. So when assigning a score, I primarily consider these two factors. Last time, I picked what is probably my least favorite episode of the show, so now I'll highlight one of my top 3 favorites. It's called In the Darkness of the Moon. This is the 20th episode of the first season, which originally aired in September of 1996. Honestly, this is one of those episodes that stayed with me throughout the 2000s and 2010s, even when I wasn't revisiting the series. As always, I'll start by summarizing the plot, since this nearly 30-year-old show isn't easily accessible outside of the US. The episode opens at night in remote snow-covered mountains of Yukon. An old man writes in his diary, its cover adorned with a coat of arms featuring a wolf's head, a detail that will resurface throughout the story. As the full moon rises, the old man transforms into a werewolf, accidentally sets his cabin on fire and runs into the wilderness. Nearby, at another cabin, Dr. Marie Metier tends to a sick boy with his father, Tuck. After they leave, the werewolf smashes through her window and attacks her, but abruptly stops upon seeing her medallion, which bears a familiar coat of arms. Hearing Marie's screams, Tuck comes back and bursts in with a rifle. The werewolf is about to kill him, but hesitates at Marie's plea, and retreats into the forest. Sometime later, Team Quest arrives to investigate the incident. Race, ever the ladies' man, quickly hits it off with Marie. As they discuss the situation in her home, Tuck arrives armed with a rifle, vowing to kill the werewolf. He reveals that his previous bullet had no effect, but now has silver bullets. Race doesn't want to kill the creature, so he's ready with tranquilizer darts instead. That night, Marie wakes to find the werewolf outside her window. She leaves her cabin and confronts the beast, which again doesn't attack her. Tuck and Jonny catch sight of her and the werewolf, but Jonny prevents Tuck from taking an accurate shot. Race hits the creature with a tranquilizer dart, but it has no effect. The men pursue the werewolf into the forest, where it brutally attacks Tuck. Race's rifle malfunctions, forcing him to club the creature with the rifle's butt. After being struck twice, the werewolf retreats. Back at the cabin, Dr. Quest doubles the tranquilizer dosage, while Marie tends to Race's wounds. The two later share a kiss, and it's implied they spend the night together. A subtle suggestion I picked up even as a kid watching in the 90s. The next day, Jonny and Race discover the old man's burned-down cabin. Inside a filing cabinet, Jonny finds a ring with a coat of arms featuring a wolf's head, and documents about the Metier family, including Marie. It seems that the creature arrived in Yukon after learning about her humanitarian work in the area. It's following her. As Jonny and Race leave, the werewolf retrieves his diary from the wreckage. Bandit the dog spots him and gives chase, with Race following, but crashing into a log. Jonny finds and helps him as night begins to fall. Bandit takes off again, and Jonny follows him to find a pack of wolves, which surround them menacingly. Before they attack, the werewolf suddenly appears and drives them off. He throws his diary to Jonny, begging him to create a serum that could cure him using the formulas within. Jonny rushes back to Race, but the wolf pack follows. He ignites his motorbike with a flare, scaring off the wolves. The fire helps Haji and Dr. Quest locate and rescue them. Back at the cabin, they identify the werewolf as Professor Metier, revealing the significance of the recurring crest. Marie explains that her family has long suffered from a genetic disease that turns the males into werewolves. She admits she hadn't believed in the legend until recent events. The professor had been attempting to create a cure when he accidentally destroyed his lab. It's also explained why he was tracking Marie. She is his last living relative. The Metier women are immune to lycanthropy, meaning the cure is in her veins. Using her blood, which carries the female recessive gene, Marie and Dr. Quest successfully isolate the key component needed to complete the serum. The team devises a plan. Marie will act as bait, so Race can administer the serum to the werewolf. She gives Race her pendant for good luck. That night, they encounter the werewolf. Without her pendant, Marie is attacked. Race struggles to get a clear shot, but Jonny leaps onto the creature's back and injects the serum. The werewolf retreats, and later that night, Tuck arrives with Professor Metier, now fully human, and rescued from the mountains. The nightmare is over. Now let's talk about the mystery and the overall plot. It's worth pointing out that this is a straightforward werewolf story. There's no ambiguity about the nature of the beast. I mention this because the original Jonny Quest series featured an episode called Werewolf of the Timberlands. Plot-wise, however, that episode was more of a prototype for Scooby-Doo. It involved smugglers dressing up in a werewolf costume to cover up their illegal activities, which is a concept the Scooby-Doo writers would reuse countless times. If you're curious how many times exactly, check out the awesome YouTube channel, Joe Goes Over. Anyway, the Jonny Quest reboot often tackled similar topics as the original series, but gave them a unique spin. In this case, we get a sympathetic narrative about a man afflicted with lycanthropy. This approach is unique. In cartoons, werewolves were typically either played for shits and giggles, or treated as just another monster, but this lore deserves much better. Of all the Universal monsters, I've always liked the werewolf the most, and it's because of the tragic core of the story. Vampires, for example, come with perks. Centuries of wealth and knowledge, for instance. Meanwhile, the werewolf curse brings nothing but pain. Losing your identity, going on uncontrollable murder sprees, and dealing with the devastating consequences of actions you couldn't control. As I discussed in my werewolf myth video, for good reason, ever since the Middle Ages, lycanthropy has often been portrayed as a tragic affliction. In the Darkness of the Moon continues this tradition. The writers clearly made an effort to tug at viewers' heartstrings. The reading of Professor Metier's journal, for example, is dripping with melodrama, and I'm the kind of person who appreciates that. Especially since this werewolf is not a pussy. He's a ferocious beast, but he doesn't want to be, yet he can't control himself.
Just 2 days ago, I came to consciousness covered in blood. Who was I do not know.
By the way, how cool is it that the episode's writers included the journal segment, allowing us to discover Metier's story from a first-person perspective? This narrative trope, often employed by H.P. Lovecraft and other horror writers that followed him, makes the story feel more personal and far more frightening. The show's take on werewolf lore is also quite interesting. It goes beyond the usual Hollywood tropes, like the curse being transmitted by a bite, transformations tied exclusively to the full moon, and death by a silver bullet. Here, Metier's lycanthropy has a genetic basis. This reminds me of Hammer's The Curse of the Werewolf, where Oliver Reed's character is a product of a sexual assault conducted by a madman, and namely such wicked circumstances of his conception condemn him to being a werewolf. Metier's transformation scene deserves praise as well. It's not only horrifying to watch, but also seems incredibly painful. It's like a toned-down animated version of the infamous transformation scenes in An American Werewolf in London, or The Howling. We see Metier at various stages of his transformation. From a man covered in fur, to a wolfman, and finally to a full wolf. He's most terrifying when he's somewhere in between. Those few seconds, where his exposed backbone is visible, scared the shit out of me as a kid. I also appreciate that the werewolf is active during the day, which is faithful to traditional lore. While media often presents them as exclusively nocturnal creatures, that's not accurate. The full moon is just the most dangerous time for the cursed. Traditionally, the werewolf curse couldn't be broken, but I don't mind the idea of using modern science to create a serum based on the genetic traits of the Metier family. The genetic explanation for lycanthropy in this episode was well established, so it fits seamlessly. The episode also flirts with the concept of a special item that can prevent transformations or ward off werewolves, as seen in Universal's The Wolfman, or Wolf, starring Jack Nicholson. Here, Marie Métier's medallion features her family crest, but it doesn't have any magical properties. Instead, it serves as a reminder to the werewolf of who she is, which helps him restrain his ferocity. This is likely why Marie is attacked later. After she gives the medallion to Race, the werewolf no longer has that visual cue to hold back. Well, she has it in this scene, but that's just typical Hanna-Barbera goof. Another aspect I appreciate is that this episode doesn't have an antagonist. Nowadays, media often focuses on anti-heroes and misunderstood villains. In 90s animation, however, we mostly saw clear-cut heroes and outright evil villains. Complex characters like Mr. Freeze, or Clayface, in Batman the Animated Series, or Jeremiah Surd and Ezekiel Rage in The Real Adventures of Jonny Quest, were rare exceptions. Professor Métier doesn't even fall into those categories. His story is purely tragic, which makes this episode particularly unique for a children's cartoon. My only criticism of the episode is that, when you think about it, Team Quest's involvement in the story feels somewhat inconsequential. Marie and the Professor are the last surviving members of the Métier family. The Professor tracks her down, because he believes her blood contains the key to creating a serum. After transforming into a werewolf, and accidentally destroying his laboratory, he seeks out Marie, possibly intending to kill her, but ultimately restraining himself. This incident draws Team Quest into the narrative, but even without their involvement, the Professor would likely have returned to Marie, later, in his human form to collaborate on the serum. That said, you could argue that Dr. Quest's scientific expertise was crucial in facilitating the cure, which justifies their presence. In that case, everything checks out. I also have mixed feelings about the romantic subplot between Race and Marie. A fair amount of time is devoted to it, but it doesn't lead to much. The only significant outcome is Marie removing her medallion, which ultimately puts her in grave danger. Then again, Race hardly needs an excuse to hit on a woman. Perhaps I'm just overthinking it.
What was that for?
Kabul.
Hey, I was only doing my job.
Still, when it comes to the story and mystery, I'm giving In the Darkness of the Moon 5 Qs out of 5. Sure, the intrigue isn't overly complex, but the narrative is superbly crafted. Several times I thought that I spotted a plot hole, just to discover upon closer viewing, that no, this was set up earlier. I also appreciate how naturally the story unfolds. Team Quest's plan to capture the werewolf using tranquilizers is straightforward. When it fails, they start gathering clues. The idea for the serum comes unexpectedly, but makes sense. It's logical that Professor Métier would deliver the formula to Jonny during a moment of clarity. Dr. Quest doesn't resort to some outlandish use of Questworld to deprogram the werewolf or whatever. He simply finishes what Métier started. Now let's talk about the thrills and action. In the Darkness of the Moon showcases possibly the scariest depiction of a werewolf in all of Western kids animation. Nothing else comes close, in my opinion. But the chills don't stop with the creature itself. I also really love the action scenes in this episode. It's not one of those where Team Quest battles faceless minions or engages in generic shootouts. Instead, the action is intimate and perilous. Usually one person against a feral beast. Watching people fire at each other doesn't do much for me, but seeing a man struggle against the raw force of nature, Race going face to face with a wolf, that's pure excitement. As is typical with this show, I also appreciate how clever the characters are. Tuck hears Dr. Métier scream. He immediately returns to check on her. Race's gun malfunctions. He improvises, using it as a club to defend himself. And when Jonny faces a pack of wolves armed with only a flare gun containing a single shot, he fires it at his bike, creating an explosion that scares off the wolves. The resulting fire and smoke also help Haji and Dr. Quest locate them. That's some creative thinking right there. I didn't catch this while first watching the episode, but editing my video helped me appreciate how well directed and well paced these action scenes are. They're perfectly clear, beautifully composed, and easy to follow. I'd recommend watching the full episode just to admire the quality of these sequences. I also love the numerous small details that enhance the visual storytelling. For example, the werewolf's almost imperceptible movements outside the window, emphasizing its status as an apex predator. The scratches on the windowpane, showcasing the deadly power of its claws. Marie's non-verbal expression of relief when she realizes that the wolf isn't going to kill her after all. Race hitting the werewolf with the butt of his rifle so hard that a chunk breaks off, highlights the sheer physical strength required to finally fend off the beast. The gasoline leaking from Race's bike, cleverly setting up the explosion triggered by a flare gun. And so many more. Unsurprisingly, when it comes to thrills and action, I give In the Darkness of the Moon 5 Qs out of 5. Overall, for me, this is the perfect Jonny Quest episode. It's well written, genuinely scary, absolutely thrilling, and visually stunning. Just look at it. I love the snowy landscapes, the trees silhouetted against the night sky, the full moon, the sunset, and the dreamlike quality of the journal reading sequence. I'm not one to over-exaggerate, but this episode really captivates me. It's a marvel. And no, this isn't just my nostalgia talking. What do you think? What's your favorite Jonny Quest episode? Which one should I cover next? I already promised SR Striker 6420 to do Eclipse, but which one should I do after that? Please leave a comment, consider liking the video, and subscribing to the channel. And join me for another Quest for Quest. Until next time, bye.